Hello and welcome everybody to my talk today, which is called the Downstream Compulsion. But before I tell you what the Downstream Compulsion actually is, I'm going to tell you very briefly who I am. So I am Luca Ingianni. I'm an aeronautical engineer by training and then kind of tumbled into IT and never found my way back out. I've spent a lot of my working life working on embedded systems, machines incorporating computers, anything from a toaster to a helicopter. I have since sort of turned my back to engineering and have become more of an agile coach, trainer, and explainer of all things collaboration, customer focus, all of the important things that really matter when we're building products. And as such, I'm actually even a creator of a DASA training course, which is DASA DevOps Specify and Verify. And in a sense, this is what today's talk will be about. And lastly, by the way, I'm also a podcast addict in the sense that I have not one, not two, but actually 3 podcasts, which you can see listed here. So this is how I spend my days. Now, finally, what is the downstream compulsion? Let me explain this to you sort of the long way around. On this slide here, I have quite a few widely used metaphors that you are probably quite familiar with. Terms like waterfall, or a pipeline, or even a value stream, or a release train, or a roadmap. What do all of those metaphors have in common? They imply directionality. They always go, that way. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that DevOps and Agile supposedly focus on feedback loops. So why don't we speak about a CI/CD loop, but about a CI/CD pipeline? Why are we talking about value streams and not, for example, value loops? Which, to my mind anyway, would make a lot more sense. Now you may say, okay, this is just semantics. So what if we call it a pipeline and not a loop? But the problem is that words matter, and the way you think about what you are doing and how you're doing it will change how you actually do it. So, of course, we all know that if you don't have enough feedback, you will become inefficient. You will not be able to successfully work iteratively. You will, in fact, even delay your feedback. So you receive all of the risks that are associated with delayed error detection. And what's even worse, you might risk compounding errors. So in other words, not closing feedback loops is dangerous and scary. Now, I think quite a few of us are familiar with the 3 ways of DevOps, which were written about first in a blog post by Gene Kim, roughly an internet century ago, something, I think in the year 2012-ish. So if you don't know the 3 ways of DevOps, in a nutshell, the first way of DevOps, Gene Kim says, is systems thinking. Not thinking in terms of, the small elements of that you are working on, but thinking of the whole, thinking of the entire system. And this means both the systems in terms of the product that you're building and the system in terms of the organization that creates and operates this product. The second way of DevOps is amplifying feedback loops. So once you've got this system perspective, you should build feedback loops that allow you to learn more about the system, improve the system over time. And then the third way is a culture of continual experimentation and learning. So not just sort of passively sitting there and waiting for learning to come flying at you and smack you in the face or something, but actively going out and trying to generate learning, generate experiments, actually using those feedback loops to your maximum advantage, actively poking the system and seeing how it reacts. And the thing is, in my observation, most organizations only get to the first way of DevOps. And this is also, well, this is the downstream compulsion, isn't it? You build a CI pipeline and it goes that way. And then do you really actively close, deliberately close the feedback loop, which would be the second way of DevOps, and not even the third way yet? In my experience, many organizations only get to the first way, if at all. And I think that is a grave danger. So let's take a step back, talk about the importance of feedback loops for a second. And I recognize that I'm, I suppose, preaching to the choir, because I'm sure all of you, dear listeners, are quite aware of the importance of feedback loops. But let's go over it anyway. So what are the feedback loop? What are the benefits of feedback loops? In a sense, they are the inverse of what I told you before about the risks of not gathering feedback. If you have feedback loops, you can be quicker at detecting and resolving issues. You can enable your organization, your product, to be continuously improved through iterative processes, and you will be able to enhance collaboration and communication within your teams. And if we are talking about feedback loops, what are we talking about anyway? Shortly speaking, everything from really short feedback loops, really tight ones like unit tests, spell checks, things that are really up to an individual developer and not an entire organization or group or something, all the way to very long-ranged, far-reaching, maybe more slowly cycling feedback loops, like how the product is actually used in production, how it's taken up by customers, etc. But the disappointing thing about feedback is it's pretty hard to collect, isn't it? You need to put in the work to define helpful metrics. You need to build mechanisms to collect the feedback that you're after. The feedback must be made available. And I'm actually calling this out as a separate step here, because I know of a lot of organizations that have ways of collecting feedback, but then it doesn't quite reach the right people. Many organizations play feedback fairly close to their chest, which I feel they really shouldn't, because there's no real reason to hide the data that you're collecting. The more people see it, the more people will be able to have good ideas and do something about the feedback. Now, after somebody has actually collected the feedback, you need to be able to react to it. And that means you need to have processes in place that goes to things like even, having a roadmap that sort of incorporates the chance that you might learn something and not just blunder blindly ahead. And last but not least, you actually need to do something with the feedback, not just collect it, not just talk about it, but actually put work in to do something with the data you've collected. And of course, you would say, yeah, that's obvious. And of course, we do that. But, there's something that I always have on my mind when I'm thinking about feedback and about agile practices. And that's a couple of years ago, I was able to observe an organization that was building transformers, and they weren't building, robotic toys. They were building energy systems. The transformer that this particular group was building was big. I would say maybe as big as a house. Anyway, it was a proper power generation transformer. Serious machine, seriously dangerous, seriously expensive. And so they tried to do it all right. They had awesome processes in place, and of course they were forward-thinking, modern, so everything was nice and agile. They had all the good stuff. They had stand-ups and retros and backlogs and roadmaps and everything. And so they spent 2 or something years working on this transformer, and they never released even a single time. And what do you think happened once they got around to making the first delivery to the customer? Well, what happened was nothing. They were unable to actually deliver because a short time before they were to deliver, they discovered that the product actually didn't work. It just didn't work. It was fundamentally flawed in such a way that they could not in good conscience deliver it to the customer. And of course, nobody had a good day that day. Because they had done everything right. They had done all of the agile stuff that you're supposed to do, except collect and act on feedback. They had never actually proven to themselves that the transformer was able to do its job. They had never proven to themselves that they could react to unwelcome surprises. And so when the time came, as it must, eventually something's going to go wrong. That's just the way it is, isn't it? They were really badly equipped to handle it, and it blew up at the worst possible time. So in other words, it's really hard to resist the downstream compulsion, really hard to resist the pull of always going forward and forward and forward and never quite collecting feedback and acting on it. So I propose we really need to get serious about shifting our mindset here. We need to go from this downstream compulsion to proper cyclical thinking, encouraging a culture of thinking in iterations, encouraging a culture of feedback and of acting on this feedback. I can't tell you how often I've sat in retros and heard the same complaints about the same issues, sprint after sprint, and somehow change never occurred. And really be very deliberate about being iterative in your working. Have cycles, iterations called out in your roadmaps. Have places where it says, okay, this is how we learn how to proceed. This is the place where we reevaluate everything that is in this roadmap and consider whether the roadmap still makes sense. And of course, everybody is encouraged to pitch in. But I think a particularly big role goes to leadership. Feedback just needs to be taken seriously. It needs to be taken seriously at all levels, technical levels, testing, let's say. Process. Do you have retros? Do you actually use them well? Culture, obviously. Is it even acceptable to express concerns, to express nasty surprises, to deliver feedback? And in fact, the problem tends not to be that you have too much feedback, but rather that you have too little of it. So you need to search for feedback. You need to fight for it. And then once you've collected, you must act on it. There is nothing more demoralizing than giving feedback and then seeing that nothing changes. Now, of course, that was a lot of theory. So how would you do this in practice? How could you go from a downstream organization to a cyclic, to an iterative organization? The first step is to find out what you actually care about. Like, what is important to you? What can you do something about anyway? And then find ways to establish regular checkpoints. Find ways to collect this feedback. Find ways to really drive feedback. And if you think back to this example of the transformer, you might say, well, how are those people supposed to generate feedback and work iteratively on something that is as big as a house and probably as expensive? Well, the point is, I think especially on systems like this, you simply can't afford to not find ways to be iterative. Yes, maybe it's harder than on a website, but you must find ways. You must be able to build models, to build mocks, to somehow be incremental. You must find them. You must build feedback mechanisms. You need to take this feedback and use it to drive change. And of course, there's a million different ways of creating feedback. Here's just a few. There's CI/CD tools. There are dashboards. There are things, organizational things like sprint reviews and retrospectives and postmortems. How do you most successfully actually apply them? How do you make sure that you are, in fact, using them in the most powerful way? I've got a secret trick for you. And the secret trick actually is quite related to one of the DASA DevOps principles, namely creating with the end in mind. I propose that you build your pipelines, that you build your systems feedback first. Much like test-driven development, where you first write a test that expresses the desired system behavior, and then you build the actual system that has this behavior. Why don't you build the feedback system first? Why don't you create the dashboard first and put the data that you care about on it, or rather the data fields that you care about on it, knowing full well that, of course, there's nothing yet to drive those data fields. And then as the next step, you build the systems that actually collect this data and transfer it to the dashboard. So be intentional about what you care for, what you look at, and then build the mechanisms that supply those important things with data. This small inversion alone, in my experience, has been very powerful in enabling teams to understand what it is that they ought to be doing and how to do it, and really think about the kind of feedback that they care about. So where do we go from here? Let me just summarize this very quickly. The downstream compulsion is something that happens to everybody to some degree. I think we get carried away, almost literally, in building the thing that supposedly we're here to build. We are building a system, we are building a product, we are building a pipeline. And that means that we get stuck on the first way of DevOps. And we need to actively, I suppose, resist this tendency and say, okay, how do I get now from the first to the second and the third way? How do I build feedback loops? How do I go from pipelines from CI/CD pipelines to CI/CD loops? How do I go from value streams to value loops? And again, I propose you do that by working with the end in mind, like DASA proposes. Build the feedback systems first, build the upstream direction first, and then build the downstream direction later. That will really streamline your thinking. It will allow you to focus on what is actually important and what you can actually do something about, instead of getting lost in what is shiny or what is easy or what feels right as opposed to being right. And I would like to just invite you to think about how well you and your organization are doing in this respect. And the judgy old is already judging you here. Where do feedback loops actually exist in your organization? Where and how do you use this feedback? What gaps exist at the moment? I encourage you to think about this as we wind down this talk. And if you want to learn more about how to build feedback systems in a deliberate way and how to go about this best, then let me just point out that, this might sound like an advertising, but I'm just really fond of this training that I created. Specify and Verify is here to help you if you want to learn more systematically how to do this. This concludes my talk. Thank you so much for your attention.